Some pretty interesting 40k news has been posted to YouTube regarding 10th Codex rollout, balance updates, and new detachments for the Space Marines and Tyranids. Let's talk Tyranid Monster Mash detachments, new combat patrols, and points updates. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about a few more details revealed by Games Workshop regarding the rollout of 40k 10th edition, and perhaps one of the most interesting questions for what happens after the big launch, and Games Workshop starts to unleash the codexes for each faction in the game. This preview was really quite an interesting one, as it looks like Games Workshop were orchestrating a collaboration with a whole bunch of YouTube channels. Stu Black, basically the face of 10th edition game design, and the head of the 40k design studio, appeared on 5 different channels: Vanguard Tactics, Tabletop Tactics, Play on Tabletop, Mini Wargaming, and Tabletop Titans, and basically sat down with each of them and answered a few cool questions. They're literally all great 40k channels that I'd have no hesitation in recommending, and each of them put their own spin on the interview, asking about different factions of the game, though there was a fair bit of overlap and just general questions about the feel and design philosophy of 10th edition as a whole. Really quite a cool community effort that Games Workshop have done there, reaching out to a lot of the major players in the game, and full credit to these guys for sharing a bunch of new info with us. I'll link all the 5 videos down in the video description, thoroughly recommend giving them a watch. While it was certainly cool to see them talking about design philosophy, I thought the most interesting things were the clarifications they did around Codex rollout, balance and points updates, and a few hints about Combat Patrol and Crusade. There was actually a decent amount of new information, or at least confirmations here, that Games Workshop hadn't shared before on their Warhammer community site or anywhere else. Getting into the actual details of the reveals, here's what else we learned about the Codexes in 10th edition, something that they understandably haven't focused on too much so far, as they're generally preparing for their rollout of the index cards first. From all the previews and teasers so far, we know that we're getting our initial index data card set. These are going to have the datasheets for all the units in your faction, plus a launch detachment with a bunch of stratagems and the army and the detachment rule on them. These will be accompanied by points in the Warhammer 40k app or potentially in a digital download as well, and will be the initial offering of the game. Then they'll start their Codex rollout. They have given us the first details of the ones to come out. It's going to be Space Marines and Tyranids first, then Admech and Necrons next. So far we know that the general idea of those is they'll have the datasheets and the points redone in them, potentially some tweaks and updates to certain units, and potentially ways to make them a bit more interesting. But the major selling point of the Codexes is that you'll be getting a whole bunch of different detachments to run your army with, so rather than just the slightly generic balanced launch detachment, you'll also get other ways to run your army with different sort of styles. Games Workshop had previously teased at, say for example, a Space Marine First Company detachment, largely revolving around veterans and Terminators. A lot of these sound like they're going to be realising sub-factions to a greater or lesser extent, or just other army archetypes within the force that you might want to play. Maybe things like Orc Dread Mob or Speed Freaks might get a look in. Otherwise they'll also have the Combat Patrol rules for your faction, and the Crusade rules as well, kind of similar to how Codexes are now really, but instead of having a whole bunch of reams of pages that you need to use all of, for the detachment rules you'll just have to select one of them and you can ignore the rest. For new information and confirmations, it sounds like the datasheets in the codexes will be redone, so basically the codex ones will supplant the index cards once the codexes come out. At launch the index cards are going to be free to download, but it doesn't necessarily sound like that's going to still be the case when the codexes come out, and then you'd have to pay Games Workshop for the rules as per now. I have a feeling that if they were still offering free datasheet downloads by the time the codexes come out, they'd probably still be telling us, as I'm sure lots of people will be very pleased. Apparently they will try to make the codex datasheets a bit visually distinct to try and tell the old ones for the new ones. That seems like a clever bit of rulebook design there. Though it does really sound like they're trying to push the Warhammer 40k app as the genuine way that you might want to build your army these days, as they say that the app will auto-update and always be true. I know the 40k app and its army builder for 9th edition got a fair bit of flack. It did have quite a lot of errors, but I feel like the new one probably has a bit more hope in 10th edition. They are starting from a standing start with far less complicated datasheets and less layered rules in different sections of the codexes, so I can't help but think that they might find it easier to build one that functions and has the data in it right. It just feels like they're not trying to reverse engineer it this time. Then beyond that, they further confirmed that detachments won't be locked to sub-factions anymore, so somewhat agnostic of the colour that you choose to paint your army. Interestingly enough, it sounds like things like enhancements will vary depending on the army, rather than just being a set number. Apparently some armies will have 3 and some armies will have 5. It's not just going to be that every single detachment has 4. They also said that there'd be around 6 stratagems. That might not be a number that's set in stone for every single army, but hopefully they'll try and keep things at least fairly on level. Perhaps a few of the most interesting teasers, though, that they dropped during the interviews were some hints at Space Marines and Tyranid detachments, and they've perhaps gone a little bit further than they have before, and given us a bit more of an idea as to the actual detachments you might expect in Codex Tyranids and Codex Space Marines. Mr. Black specifically called out the name of the Crusher Swarm and the Infiltration Swarm, two other different ways to play Tyranids. The Crusher Swarm is apparently Tyranid's monster mash, so I guess focusing on Carnifexes and other big beasties like that, and the Infiltration Swarm is one that's particularly focused on things like Lictors and Gene Stealers and the stealth-type organisms. I'm sure those new Von Ryan's Leapers will fit in quite well there. In previews that they've done before, they said that some detachments will restrict the amount of units that you might be able to take in a certain army. Say certain units might be banned in certain formations, and you might not be allowed to take them full stop. Here though, they said that they might not necessarily actually limit the datasheets that you can take in some of these forces, but you might just have all the support skew towards a certain style of play. Say for example the Tyranid Crusher Swarm, I'm sure that all the detachment rule and the stratagems and things will all benefit the big monsters, so you're going to have heavy incentive to run as many of those as possible to get the most out of it. I kind of like the idea of that, maybe being nudged into taking certain models that way but not necessarily having to. Sounds kind of fun and hopefully will encourage different ways of play. I can imagine though that it might mean that certain units might be kind of hard to balance. Say for example a Tyranid monster at 1 points cost could be a bit overpowered and very strong in the Crusher Swarm, whereas without all the supporting rules it might be kind of weak in an Infiltration Swarm or Invasion Swarm, so it might be kind of hard to have one unifying points value that makes it fair for all of them. I guess that's kind of what we have currently though in 40k, different sub-factions, and they are just genuinely better with different units. Otherwise, there were just a few teasers for the Space Marine detachments as well. We already basically know about two of them, the Gladius Task Force and the First Company Strike Force, the Balanced Launch Detachment and the one that focuses on veterans that's been teased multiple times now. But beyond that, in quite a few of the interviews, an example of a bike company was used quite a lot. I guess that will be something that the Space Marines would quite like to have, and particularly White Scars players to be able to represent their biker forces. I think that with that being mentioned as an example quite a lot, seems pretty likely that we'll get a bike-heavy detachment when the Space Marine Codex comes out, maybe a spiritual successor to the White Scars force that gives them a bunch of extra stratagems and a fancy detachment rule. Otherwise, another really interesting section I thought were the balance updates for 10th edition. Good job to Vanguard Tactics for asking some sensible questions about this. Previously they have mentioned that they'd be doing a competitive play pack, basically a set of recommendations for tournaments and things for their new mission deck, and basically recommending a combo of the random cards, say a deployment zone with a primary mission and the twist mission rule, and they can be sent out to players ahead of time, maybe just removing a little bit of an element of chance from the mission pack to make sure that players' armies just aren't utterly ruined by an unfortunate combination of cards should it exist. Apparently that competitive play mission pack will be coming every 6 months. That's to be happening at the same time as the balanced data slate, so I guess the tournaments for the following 6 months after that would follow the new mission card rules, maybe kind of similar to how the chapter approved objective things work at the moment. Then perhaps the most interesting bit out of the balance changes are when points, balanced data slates, and mission decks come out, and it seems that the schedule for those is quarterly, 6-monthly, and yearly. In the interview and in previous things, they say that their balance pass frequency is about right at the moment. That is something that they've asked for feedback in surveys before now, trying to keep changes just to certain points in the year and not just firing off FAQs and random changes just as things come up. First up, one of the most interesting things is that they've kind of swapped the frequency of the points updates and the balanced data slates. Currently, we've got quarterly balanced data slates and 6 monthly points adjustments. I feel like the swap seems like quite a sensible one, to be honest. Points are perhaps one of the easiest ways to rebalance armies, and particularly rein in super strong units or armies or buff weak ones. And with the design philosophy of 10th edition focusing a lot more on the datasheets, it does seem like points might be more powerful than ever to try and make units more balanced against each other. I feel like in at least a couple of their balanced data slates where they couldn't update points as well, they were a bit hamstrung by this. They did change a bunch of rules in the balanced data slates, but without being able to adjust points, there was only so much they could do, not unless they wanted to add on extra random bolt-on mechanics to certain factions to try and make them more playable. Looks like flat out rules changes are going to be a little bit more rare now, 6-monthly rather than quarterly. And then for actual major changes to their missions, they will have a yearly new mission deck, a new set of cards for players to buy no doubt if they want to keep up with the current match play game. Again, that feels kind of similar to how it is now, to be honest. Even though they release the chapter approved every 6 months, it doesn't actually fundamentally rewrite all the missions. It tends to change more things like secondaries and maybe more peripheral things to playing a game rather than the actual way that missions are scored. Overall, seems like a pretty reasonable system to me. It sounds like they'll be delivering their points digitally again, so no need to actually have to shell out for books or wait for big wait times for points to come out in print. That's definitely a big improvement that we've had during 9th edition that they didn't used to do before. All seems fairly sensible. If there's a faction that's really struggling for some reason, they wouldn't have to wait for too long until they can get a points boost. Finally, there were just a few more details on Crusade and Combat Patrol. Not really all that much very firm on these, but still just a couple of interesting points to say the direction that they're going as the Codexes come out. Games Workshop have already announced this Crusade supplement called Tyrannic War. That's going to be the one that's contained within the Leviathan book and also available to buy separately if you don't pick up that one. And this looks like the main way that they're going to be adding more narrative supplements into Warhammer 40k. Maybe kind of similar to the Warzone type books that they've had throughout 9th edition, but not crowbarring in a whole bunch of match play rules that might only add up to a page or two of rules for your entire faction out of a big book. Seems pretty good to me. That was a change that was really quite well received when they announced it for Arcs of Omen. Not try and lump everything together as a big weird combined offering that people are very rarely going to use all of. The people who want the Crusade supplement can pick it up, and the people who don't can just skip out the book. I did find it kind of interesting as well. They mentioned that they tracked how many people played narrative versus match play very roughly, but didn't seem to be too keen to share any numbers. Finally, there were a couple of combat patrol details. Perhaps one of the most interesting little snippets was that apparently they might well be updating the combat patrols as codexes drop, so the ones that came out in 9th edition might not necessarily be staying the same way as they are right now. I kind of feel for the majority of the 9th edition combat patrols, they've got fairly good discount offerings for the most of them. I can imagine that a few armies might like to have theirs changed though, maybe things like Thousand Sons with all their Zangors. They didn't really 100% clarify that it would be literally every combat patrol for every single codex. I guess they might do it on a case-by-case basis, but it kind of has interesting implications now that Combat Patrol is a game mode as well as just a box you can buy. But they seem to imply that you'd probably be able to play either the old Combat Patrol or the new one. I certainly hope that when a faction gets their codex, it doesn't immediately invalidate the old Combat Patrol from being played in that game mode. That would be a bit sad. Sounds like at least some factions will have multiple ways to play Combat Patrol though as 10th edition unfolds. You might be able to play the new or the old version of it. Finally, there was also a question as well about balance changes, I think in Play on Tabletop's video, asking whether or not they'd think about rebalancing Combat Patrol if it became obvious that some factions were too strong and some factions were too weak. I think understandably Mr. Black said that they'd be a bit reluctant to do this and would really like to aim to get it right first time, as if you're trying to launch a really easy to play starter rule set for Warhammer 40k, the last thing that you want to do is add a whole bunch of FAQs and things to look up that might not be particularly obvious where they are. I feel like even with their best intentions, and even with being able to alter things like stratagems and secondaries to balance them up a bit, I feel like the Combat Patrol game mode is unlikely to be a super balanced game, just because it's at a small points level, and it's almost always going to be super swingy or matchup dependent. I feel like even if it isn't 100% balanced, it's still going to be a fun game mode, and I think it will be fun to try out for some quick casual games. Let me know your thoughts though on the new details on codexes, combat patrols, and balance updates. Kind of interesting to see how these things are going to be rolling out. And of course, check out all these interviews that I'll link down in the video description if you'd like to see the details as they were told, plus a whole bunch of other fun and supporting questions around the game. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and updates, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be keeping the regular 40k videos coming, and I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, or you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.